Farewell to purchasing inferior products from competing companies, declared the president's wife, single-handedly terminating a crucial contract. As a key client, her decision left me anxious, yet amidst the concern, inspiration struck. Understood. We will cease all deliveries to your company, I confidently asserted, sealing the deal with my signature on the contract she presented. Later, the president's wife returned to our premises, her countenance drained of color, a blend of shock and dismay evident. My name is Mia, aged 37, and I helm the company passed down from my grandfather, a bastion of stability with a roster of esteemed clients. To safeguard our legacy and workforce, I immersed myself in economic studies and business development. Specializing in precision mechanical equipment, our seasoned employees, some with tenure dating back to my grandfather's era, impart invaluable knowledge. My dedication hasn't gone unnoticed. I've garnered trust and respect, even among the elder staff. However, the journey to further recognition is ongoing. There's always more to learn. Then, an extraordinary incident unfolded within our midst, the catalyst being the president's wife of a pivotal client. Despite our long-standing relationship, she derided me as a childish girl unfit to lead. Mrs. Brown's unexpected appearance at her husband's year-end gala, where I was invited, marked our initial encounter. After cordial pleasantries, she delivered a disconcerting warning, insinuating potential repercussions for perceived deception. Confounded by her animosity, I observed Mrs. Brown's amiable demeanor with others, contrasting sharply with her demeanor towards me. As the evening waned, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, pondering the underlying motives behind her hostility. And so, as the festivities concluded, rather than attending the after-party, I retreated to contemplate the unsettling exchange. I resolved to visit my parents' house, seeking insight into Mrs. Brown's perplexing behavior. With both my parents and grandparents residing there, it served as a sanctuary where I often sought counsel from my grandfather. Upon arrival, I extended my apologies for the late hour, met with warm welcomes from my parents, who informed me that my grandfather was still awake. Eager to delve into the matter, I sought out my grandfather to inquire about Mrs. Brown's character. To my bewilderment, my grandfather painted her as an epitome of perfection, a devoted wife unfalteringly supporting her husband, devoid of ulterior motives. Yet, the more I learned, the more perplexed I became regarding Mrs. Brown's demeanor. Days after the eventful party, Mrs. Brown made an unexpected appearance at my company, much to the surprise of my staff and secretary. Her unannounced visit left her waiting, a situation that evidently irked her. Venting her frustration, she chastised my secretary, attributing the company's alleged incompetence to my leadership, a sentiment I found unjustified, given the circumstances. Regrettably absent during Mrs. Brown's visit, I swiftly arranged a meeting to address her grievances. Upon entering the president's office, I anticipated encountering her husband, only to find Mrs. Brown occupying his seat, exuding an air of superiority. Despite this, I extended my apologies for my prior unavailability and expressed a willingness to address her concerns. To my surprise, Mrs. Brown abruptly declared goodbye to utilizing inferior products from other companies, a statement that left me momentarily taken aback. I stood in stunned silence, my expression surely betraying my disbelief as Mrs. Brown leveled her accusations. A company overseen by someone as inexperienced as you simply can't be relied upon, she asserted, citing alleged overcharging and questioning the quality of our products. Her assertions were baseless, prompting me to vehemently defend our pricing and passionately extol the superior quality of our offerings, endorsed by the president himself. Yet Mrs. Brown remained obstinate, refusing to entertain reason, her condescending demeanor grating on my nerves. When pressed about the president's awareness, she revealed her interim role as acting president, granted due to her spouse's sudden departure abroad to address production issues. It dawned on me why the president had been absent from the recent gathering. With finality, Mrs. Brown decreed our impending contract termination, insisting on a prompt meeting the following day to finalize the details. Feeling unceremoniously dismissed, I departed her office, a sense of urgency settling over me. The realization struck hard. Losing Mrs. Brown's company as a client posed a significant threat to our financial stability. Without their patronage, meeting payroll could become precarious. A palpable sense of crisis engulfed me as I contemplated the impending challenge of securing our company's future. Frantically, I racked my brain for strategies to salvage the imperial contract. The following day, Mrs. Brown punctually arrived at our premises, her demeanor somber as she placed the termination documents on my desk, urging swift action. Refusing to sign without consulting the president, I pleaded for time, only to be met with dismissive remarks about our operations' scale in comparison to their corporate stature. Infuriated by Mrs. Brown's arrogant stance and the abrupt termination, I felt betrayed by the lack of remorse for severing our long-standing ties. Resolute in my decision, I enacted the contingency plan I had devised. In a moment of clarity, I confronted Mrs. Brown. Her laughter at my inquiry met with a steely resolve from my end. With a swift stroke, I affirmed our withdrawal from future dealings, momentarily catching her off guard before she regained her composure, seemingly satisfied with the outcome. As Mrs. Brown departed, her self-satisfied demeanor evident, my secretary and I exchanged polite bows, concealing inner smiles. Reflecting on the situation, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of amusement, contemplating her oversight and hastily concluding the agreement. Following her departure, I extended gratitude to Mrs. Brown's husband via email, expressing appreciation for past collaborations. Moments later, a call disrupted the quiet of our office, signaling the beginning of a new chapter. I found myself caught off guard by the unexpected call, but quickly regained composure upon reading the president's email. Agreeing to his request for a meeting, I awaited his arrival alongside Mrs. Brown, her demeanor displaying clear discontent. Formalities exchanged, the president wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. Seated comfortably, I narrated the sequence of events leading to the contract termination, Mrs. Brown's abrupt decision, and my subsequent response. As I recounted my frustrations, the president's complexion paled, immediately offering a sincere apology. Mrs. Brown, visibly surprised by his reaction, attempted to intervene with a sharp rebuke, but the president's resolve remained firm. Against Mrs. Brown's objections, the president insisted on extending an apology, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. With a mixture of reluctance and disbelief, she reluctantly complied, her displeasure palpable. Turning to me, the president earnestly implored for reconsideration, highlighting the significant impact the termination would have on their company. Despite Mrs. Brown's silent disapproval, he continued to express remorse, underscoring their reliance on our partnership. As tensions simmered, it became evident that despite any potential repercussions, our company's significance to theirs couldn't be ignored. With a nod of understanding, I acknowledged the president's plea, signaling a potential pathway to reconciliation. I've already secured contracts with overseas companies to replace it. What's the problem with that? Mrs. Brown maintained her assertive stance. I couldn't help but sigh in exasperation at her demeanor. Witnessing my reaction, the president was visibly shocked, unleashing a furious reprimand upon Mrs. Brown. "You don't understand anything. How could you do this without consideration? We've had a faithful relationship with this company for 40 years. Do you understand the significance of that?" His words fell on deaf ears as Mrs. Brown laughed them off, asserting her disregard for old relationships. "So what? I don't care about old relationships. Cutting ties with this company will reduce costs, allowing us to lower the prices of our own products. It's all beneficial," she retorted, unyielding in her stance. The president's anger only intensified, regretting his decision to let her act as president. In a moment of triumph, Mrs. Brown's phone interrupted the confrontation. Brushing off the call with irritation, her demeanor shifted to panic and confusion. Sensing something amiss, I waited until she ended the call before inquiring about the issue. Seemingly overwhelmed, Mrs. Brown began to mutter about delayed and inferior goods from the overseas company. I couldn't help but mockingly laugh at her distress, explaining that such setbacks were to be expected. Our precision mechanical equipment boasted unique craftsmanship and technology, qualities that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Confounded, Mrs. Brown demanded clarification. Firmly, I elaborated on the significance of our company's cultivated technology and craftsmanship. emphasizing that our products incorporated techniques unavailable elsewhere. It was a moment of realization for Mrs. Brown as she finally grasped the true value of our offerings. Confidently, I made my stance clear, prompting a shift in Mrs. Brown's demeanor from aggression to frustration and defeat. Maintaining my composure, I faced her with a triumphant expression, observing as she retreated into sullen silence, her demeanor akin to that of a sulking child. Curious about the motivations behind her actions, I pressed Mrs. Brown for an explanation. With a defined attitude, she began to unravel her intentions, her desire to pass the company to her son conflicting with her husband's plans. It became evident that her actions were driven by a misguided attempt to secure her son's future by positioning him as the company's president, a plan thwarted by her husband's opposition. Seizing an opportunity presented by overseas complications, Mrs. Brown had orchestrated a series of maneuvers to consolidate power and eliminate perceived threats, including severing long-standing partnerships and pursuing alternative contracts. However, her plans unraveled upon discovering her son's true aspirations, leading to a moment of reckoning. In a surprising turn, the president revealed their son's preference for pursuing agriculture, not business, an admission that left Mrs. Brown visibly shaken. Confronted with the reality of her son's desires, her resolve faltered and she sank to the floor in defeat. With sincerity, the president pleaded for a chance to rectify the situation, expressing a willingness to amend the terms of our contract. Extending a hand in reconciliation, I proposed a path forward on the condition that Mrs. Brown relinquish her involvement in the company's management. While the president's relief was palpable, Mrs. Brown remained embittered, insisting that the termination documents would stand. Despite her resistance, a glimmer of hope emerged as the possibility of reconciliation beckoned, marking a pivotal moment in our dealings with Mrs. Brown and her company. I stood firm in my decision not to invalidate the contract termination, a move driven by Mrs. Brown's unwavering ambition for her son to ascend to the presidency. Despite her stubbornness, I remained composed, suggesting she revisit the contract documents. In a pointed gesture, I drew attention to an overlooked detail, my signature placed outside the designated area. Mrs. Brown's silence spoke volumes as she grappled with the realization of her oversight. With a calm admonition, I underscored the importance of meticulousness in managerial roles, a trait seemingly lacking in Mrs. Brown's approach. As the president eagerly examined the document, gratitude overflowed from him, contrasting sharply with Mrs. Brown's remorseful demeanor. Relieved to have preserved a crucial contract, I earned praise from my grandfather for safeguarding our employees' future. However, Mrs. Brown's duplicity extended beyond our dealings, prompting widespread apologies from the president to affected companies. I lent my assistance in clarifying the situation, fostering cooperation among those wronged by Mrs. Brown's actions. Consequently, Mrs. Brown faced repercussions, ousted from the management team and embroiled in divorce proceedings with the president. Despite her resistance, his resolve remained unyielding, driven by a sense of betrayal. Meanwhile, her son found liberation from his mother's pressures, pursuing his agricultural studies with newfound independence. For my company, the ordeal yielded unforeseen benefits, garnering favor with major corporations and attracting new contracts. Sales surged, surpassing even my grandfather's achievements, while employee morale soared. As I continued to lead and learn, the lessons gleaned from this experience reaffirmed my commitment to growth and integrity.